In this session, we're going to be talking about quantitative data collection. So this is an extension of the previous day's work on qualitative data and reframing this idea of what will our study data or evidence be to consider the quantitative data collection, particularly from surveys. So in survey research, we're often thinking about things like versatility, efficiency, and generalizability. This notion of generalizability will come up kind of uniquely in contrast to qualitative work, where generalizability is less of a concern or a priority. We also need to think about errors in survey research. So those are both about errors of observation and non-observation. So that could include who's being missed in the survey, who's not being included, who refused to participate. That random sampling may still result in some sampling error, and that there are other kinds of ways within the sampling process that this distorted sampling can become an issue. Those are ways in terms of non-observation. The errors in observation are more issues that we can flesh out thinking through things like selection bias or the Hawthorne effect, where people are doing things differently when they're being watched, social desirability, etc. When you're designing questionnaires, it's important to have a consistent focus in terms of what's being included in the questionnaires, but also in terms of being consistent across surveys. If there are multiple surveys being included of the same population over a period of time, to have that consistency so that the measures aren't changing at each time point, and you actually still have comparability of the measures across multiple surveys because you've included the same measures. It's ideal to build on existing instruments, even if you're trying to investigate something that is new and for which there aren't existing instruments that are well validated. You want to think about the order of the questions, both in terms of participant burden, but also in terms of the sense that the participant understands what the survey is about and is really willing to open up reasonably, so that you're putting the more sensitive questions kind of in the middle toward the end, and thinking about the order of the questions as a way to keep people thinking about the similar kinds of domains and work your way through pretty seamlessly from section to section. Adding interpretive questions can be useful, and then making the questionnaire attractive. So that's more in the terms of the formatting, making it easy to read, easy to follow, clear about how and where somebody should be putting a check if it's a paper survey, or if it's an online survey, not having too much text on the screen, but also not so little that people have to click through after each individual question. So considering how the participant is interacting with the questionnaire is really important. Writing questions is more difficult than many people think. Writing clear questions is really hard. Having a really understandable question that is only asking about sort of one thing at a time, and you know that it's being interpreted and understood in the same way by a variety, theoretically all of your participants, can be really challenging and take some work. You want to think about closed-ended questions, like a Likert scale question, or open-ended questions that offer some possibility for potentially a longer answer. Within closed-ended questions, you want to think about the response categories, and are they complete? Are they appropriate? If you are including an other, please specify sort of category, is that going to be something that most of the people are going to need because your response categories aren't actually fully appropriate for your participant sample? Thinking about matrix questions where people are able to choose all that apply, or ways in which people can sort of be comparing multiple phenomena at once. So the intersection between two different issues. And then also thinking about sensitive subjects. Again, being really cautious about how those questions are worded, where they come in the survey, and how the phrasing and context is offered to the participant become really important. For writing clear questions, things that seem very obvious but can be really challenging in practice, to avoid confusing phrasing, to avoid being vague, offering some frame of reference, both about why you're asking. Often that comes at the top of a series of, let's say, 10 questions on a given domain. You may want to prompt that you're saying, here's what we're about to start asking you about. Avoiding negative words, so asking somebody what they do prefer rather than what they don't prefer. And also double negatives. What don't you prefer not to do is really confusing. Also, double-barreled questions. Double-barreled questions are typically two questions that are joined with an and or an or. So do you prefer chocolate and vanilla ice cream is confusing because you could prefer vanilla but not chocolate, and then you are unable to disentangle why someone's saying no. So asking one question at a time and considering the amount of jargon that you're being in asking a participant to understand is really important. Being cautious with memory questions is this last point, and we'll think about that also in terms of how reliable your questions are if they're asking to measure something over time. But in terms of a memory question, you want to think about how far back you can reasonably expect a participant to reflect in the last 2 weeks, in the last week, in the last month. And sometimes there are questions about in the last year, but typically not often that much further back than in the last year. Closed-ended and open-ended questions. So again, closed-ended is referring to questions that have a specific and a answer from a set of response categories that are offered to the participant. So questions like, on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, that's 1 to 5, how much do you agree with the following statement? An open-ended question instead would be for the participant to write or type in their own response. This is a bit more like a qualitative question where you're going to get more text data, and you could say, what are your thoughts on thing X, rather than do you agree or disagree that thing X is good. So those are going to be different types of questions, and you want to use them strategically for different purposes. Often the closed-ended questions are ones where you know what the answer categories would be, and even if they're asking for an attitude in relation to sort of an agreement or disagreement, or how likely someone is to do something or isn't to do something, those can be useful prompts as ways of capturing really concrete, specific, and evidence and data that is comparable between individuals. The open-ended questions are going to give you, in some ways, some more detail, but it makes it hard to compare across individuals. And so open-ended questions in a survey can be often left blank as well, or pretty brief answers. So thinking really cautiously about what you're expecting to get from an open-ended question is also probably a good practice. So for closed-ended questions, thinking about if all of those response categories are about agreement or disagreement, that you might get some sort of acquiesce bias. So somebody may not actually disagree, but because all of your answer options are on a scale of neutral to disagree and strongly disagree and the strongest disagreement possible, and I couldn't possibly disagree even more strongly than that, those are your answer options. Somebody's going to say neutral who would actually have agreed with the statement. And the similar sort of thing for social desirability, where the participant is going to answer questions in a way that they expect the researcher wants them to. You want to minimize fence sitting. So often with a neutral question, so a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, if people really feel in the middle, they're going to answer 3. But it's not always really clear what to do with that analytically. What does it mean that you're neutral on a given topic? Is it that you don't know? Is it that you haven't really thought about it? Is it that you do actually agree or disagree and you are unwilling to share that kind of option? What you may want to include is a don't know option. And in fact, with online surveys, you can even require that people designate some answer before proceeding. So rather than leaving something blank, they may be able to say don't know. You might use filter questions. So those are questions that would preclude the next 10 questions from being asked. So something like, have you ever used tobacco or smoked in your life? Yes or no. And for people who say no, you don't then have to ask a bunch of questions about the specific behaviors that people were engaging in or currently are engaging in around their tobacco use. So thinking about ways to sort of filter people through parts of the survey can be really useful. So the matrix questions, this idea is really about grouping a series of questions under their common theme. So that can be really useful where the respondents rather don't read each and every question. They're just giving the same response for all of the questions in the matrix. There could be a number of different a different individual question. And they're using the same response categories for every single question, and people could potentially just answer the same way all the way down. They're just going to be agree or neutral for every single question. For sensitive topics, you want to think about phrasing the questions as non-combatively and openly as possible to increase the response rate. So certainly not to have a biased or leading question ever, but in particular with sensitive topics. So it almost seems silly to make a suggestion that somebody would ask this question this way, but something like, you would never have used drugs in your life, right? Right. So you certainly don't want to be that biased and leading in your questions. But even to think about drug use, how you frame drug use and portray the openness to all response options is going to give you better data. It's going to protect your participants. It's going to make you a more ethical researcher in terms of how you are approaching and interacting with your community, etc. So thinking about those sensitive topics that are often of interest to social work research and really treating them with the care that they deserve is really important. Refining and testing is also extremely important, particularly when you have new questions. Cognitive interviews are really useful. These can be places where, to that clear question sort of idea, you can ask people or pilot the survey and with a participant and then ask them after each question to think aloud as they're answering it so that they can express, I didn't really understand what this piece of it meant. And so what I assumed they were asking was blank, but I'm not positive, so I'm just going to answer whatever. So that cognitive interview is really a way for you to get effectively in the participant's head and to understand their way of processing the questions. This can be really useful, again, when there are new questions that you're unsure will work. And that can be a really useful way. Behavioral coding, you can observe several interviews, codes, and code problems that occur within the administration of the survey. So somebody sort of sitting in and just taking notes of where the issues are, where you're going to catch, especially for online stuff, if there's a skip pattern. So there was a filter question. Did it work appropriately? Are there glitches in the system that are making it hard to answer? And then for sort of all sorts of studies, you'd probably want to pilot those questionnaires, particularly if it's online or using some kind of electronic data collection software, to be able to pretest those questions and the procedures, but also to pretest those questions within your community. So there may be a valid scale that was validated in 150 white undergraduate psychology majors in 1972. Does that actually work for your population of interest? So thinking about how to pretest those questions and make sure the length is appropriate, that the language level is appropriate, etc. So thinking about the administration, where you're going to administer the survey, the questionnaire structure, and the cost all become really important. There are some alternatives to direct in-person surveys. You can do mail surveys or group administered surveys where everybody's multiple people are conducting the survey at once, or multiple respondents are participating at once. Telephone and surveys, or in-person surveys, electronic surveys, so online research, and then mixed mode surveys, some of which might be in person, and then maybe you leave some questions for people to answer privately and then mail them back to you. So the whole thing isn't by mail, but you are able to have a few different ways of administering the survey in a way that breaks up the participant burden, and also makes the cost less in terms of the staff time that are required for collecting that kind of data. Thinking about, again, this idea of the diverse society, that one key component here is thinking about language, and translating instruments really necessitates a bunch of different kinds of equivalence, and equivalence meaning in terms of the answer options and what's going on with the language. So thinking about things like diagnostic criteria, how is the content coming through? Is there a semantic definition? Are there technical terms that are being used and need to be translated? Are there criterion or other conceptual pieces that are embedded in the questions? This is really common in social work research around psychological phenomena that do have diagnostic criteria, and the translation becomes really critical. Not every individual who is theoretically bilingual knows all the technical terms that are really necessary. Many existing well-validated scales have options or versions in multiple languages. Particularly American scales often have English and Spanish. But even then, to think about dialects or particular, if it's for Spanish from Spain versus Latin American Spanish, there can be any number of issues that you want to be sensitive to and conscious of. And then the interviewer and respondent characteristics. So if there's a big difference in terms of age, if there are differences in terms of race, gender, other dimensions that are going to make an insider-outsider dynamic, that are going to affect social desirability or the respondent's ability to feel like they are able to answer open and honestly and without judgment, become really important. And those are things to think about, it both in terms of the staffing for your survey, but also in terms of the data collection. And then again, the implications for evidence-based practice. So thinking about cross-sectional surveys, that they can be used to come to a better understanding of how the effect of some program or intervention happened at a specific moment. So this is where we're thinking about surveys, particularly cross-sectional surveys, rather than an experiment unto itself, but larger surveys could really be helpful for capturing evidence-based practice sort of effectiveness. And then they can also be really useful to think about needs assessments, so the use or lack of use of various services, why people aren't using existing services, or their sort of feelings about them, what kinds of services they are going to need. So those needs assessment tools can be really valuable in terms of short surveys of your client base, of what kinds of programs would they want to have happen, or are they aware that certain programs are happening, etc. So thinking about surveys at a fixed point in time with a series of open and closed-ended questions, thinking about the phrasing of questions, how those closed-ended questions are being interpreted, how the answer options match or don't match, or how complete they are for the closed-ended questions so that you're getting good data, how to minimize missing data with or hard to interpret data with things like a neutral category, or people just leaving them blank rather than checking don't know. So there's a number of these different sorts of particular situations that arise with survey research and closed-ended questions that we want to try to consider when using quantitative survey sorts of designs, which can be a really effective use, but be mindful of these cautions and potential pitfalls in order to avoid them become really important and useful.